You won't believe what really went on behind those massive temple walls in ancient Egypt, stuff that sounds like a total horror show with priests and so-called temple virgins. Clickbait titles scream about nightmares worse than death, secret sacrifices, and dark rituals on innocent young women. But hang on, because the truth is way more interesting, and yeah, it flips the whole scary story upside down. Ready to dive in? Let's unpack this step by step by keep it real, chatty, and packed with facts, so you stick around till the end. First off, those viral videos and clicky articles, they're pulling from wild misunderstandings or straight-up inventions. They paint Egyptian priests as creepy villains, forcing temple virgins into awful stuff like abuse or human sacrifice. Sounds terrifying, right? But historians and archaeologists who've dug through actual Egyptian records, tombs, papyrus scrolls, temple carvings, say, nope, zero evidence for that. No mentions of priests harming young women in temples. No virgin sacrifices. Egyptian religion was all about keeping balance. They called it mat, not dark nightmares. Egyptian priests were not just religious men. They were administrators, scientists, doctors, and astronomers rolled into one. The higher the rank, the closer they were to the pharaoh, and the more influence they held over Egypt's government. The high priest of Ammon at Thebes, for example, wielded almost the same authority as the king himself during certain periods. He managed huge temple estates, controlled massive agricultural lands, and employed thousands of workers. Temples were not just sacred spaces, they were economic engines that kept Egypt running smoothly. But there was also a darker side to this control. Some priests became so powerful that later pharaohs had to strip them of wealth and privileges to restore balance. Temples could become hotbeds of corruption, where sacred duties mixed with politics, greed, and personal ambition. In some cases, priests used divine authority to manipulate local rulers or influence royal decisions. Over centuries, the spiritual guardians of the gods became gatekeepers of power. About those so-called temple virgins, here's where history gets tangled with myth. Many later Greek and Roman writers spoke of women who served Egyptian gods in secret chambers. But when modern historians looked closer, the evidence for such practices turned out to be thin. Egypt did have women working in temples, but their roles were nothing like the lurid tales that came centuries later. These women were known as God's wives, divine adoratrices, or singers of Ammon. They weren't prisoners or sacrifices, they were elite women from noble or royal families, chosen to serve the gods through music, offerings, and prayer. The most famous of them, Amosnefortari, was a queen who became the first to hold the title God's wife of Ammon. She wasn't forced into servitude. She was one of the most respected women in Egypt, overseeing temple lands and finances. Some of these women even had their own staff, estates, and political authority. So where did the nightmare stories come from? Much of the confusion started when Greek and Roman historians, centuries after Egypt's golden age, tried to interpret Egyptian religion through their own moral lens. To them, Egypt's rituals looked strange, even shocking. The Greeks couldn't understand why Egyptians shaved their bodies, bathed multiple times a day, or treated animals like gods. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described priests performing secret rituals in the dark, with no public audience allowed. To outsiders, secrecy often equals suspicion. Later writers filled the gaps in his stories with speculations, some exaggerated, some imagined. Over time, rumors spread that Egyptian temples hid forbidden ceremonies involving women, but there's no evidence that these claims were true. Modern Egyptologists studying temple walls and ancient papyrus texts have discovered something very different. The priests lived under strict purity laws. They had to bathe 4 times a day, wear clean linen, shave their heads and bodies, avoid certain foods like fish or pork. They often stayed celibate during temple service, not for life, but for the duration of their duties. Before entering the inner sanctum, the most sacred chamber, they purified themselves with natron, a type of natural salt that symbolized cleanliness and renewal. The goal wasn't indulgence, it was discipline. The Egyptians believed that a god could only be approached by a body and mind free of impurity. Inside the temple, priests didn't perform wild ceremonies. Their rituals were precise and solemn. Every morning, they entered the holy room, opened the shrine that held the statue of the god, and performed the awakening ritual. They washed, anointed, and dressed the statue, offered incense, food, and drink, and then sealed the shrine again. No outsiders ever saw this ritual. It happened in silence, deep within the temple's hidden heart. The atmosphere was more like a laboratory than a cult. Everything followed cosmic order, or Mahat, the Egyptian idea of balance and truth. The priests weren't trying to please themselves. They were keeping the universe from falling into chaos. So what about fertility symbols carved all over temple walls, the lotuses, ankhs, and figures of male and female gods? These weren't erotic decorations. They were symbols of life, rebirth, and creation. The story of Osiris and Isis, for example, centers on resurrection and the renewal of nature. When later cultures retold these myths, they often misunderstood them. What Egyptians saw as sacred metaphors, others interpreted literally. And that's how the myths about sexual temple rituals began to take shape. Archaeological evidence tells a much clearer story. Excavations at Thebes, Abydos, and Karnak show temples with separate areas for purification, offerings, archives, and priest quarters. The daily schedule of a temple priest was full of duties, rituals at sunrise, offerings offerings at midday, prayers in the evening, and administration in between. There's no sign of any nightmare practices, but human flaws existed. Some inscriptions and records mention priests stealing gold from statues or secretly taking temple goods home. So yes, eruption happened, but it was about power and money, not the kind of rumors ancient gossip liked to spread. The Temple of Amun at Karnak was the most powerful religious center in Egypt. Its priests grew so influential that they sometimes rivaled the pharaoh himself. At one point, the high priest of Amun controlled vast estates, entire cities, and a private army. To cut them down to size, pharaohs like Akhenaten tried to replace Amun's cult with new gods, such as Aten. That political religious war almost tore Egypt apart. It's another reminder that behind the calm stone faces of the temples, enormous struggles for power were taking place. Women also played crucial roles in this drama. The gods' wives of Amun weren't just ceremonial figures, they acted as spiritual queens in Thebes, performing sacred rituals that symbolized Egypt's divine order. In some cases, these women ruled southern Egypt with as much influence as the king's officials. They never lived as victims locked in temples. They were educated, powerful, and wealthy. By the time Greek and Roman visitors arrived, the old system had decayed. Rituals were repeated mechanically, and priests often no longer understood their original meanings. Outsiders, seeing strange customs without context, assumed the worst. Stories of virgins, secret chambers, and ritual pleasures were born from that misunderstanding. Over centuries, those tales grew darker and more dramatic, turning priests into villains in the eyes of later storytellers. But modern archaeology has restored the truth. Ancient Egyptian religion was full of mystery, yes, but its mysteries were intellectual and spiritual, not scandalous. The people who worked in those temples were more like scholars than cultists. They studied astronomy to track the Nile's flooding, medicine to heal the sick, and mathematics to design temples aligned perfectly with the stars. Their goal was harmony between the human world and the divine. The more we learn about Egypt, the more we see how much gossip and legend have distorted it. It's easy to sell stories about dark secrets and forbidden rituals, but the real story is just as captivating. Picture the morning sun rising over the temples of Karnak. The priests, dressed in spotless linen, walk silently through columns taller than trees. They light incense, whisper hymns to Amun, and present offerings of bread, beer, and flowers. Outside, the city stirs to life, trusting that these sacred acts will keep the sun rising and the Nile flowing. That's what the temples were about, keeping the balance of the universe intact. Ancient Egypt didn't need scandal to be mysterious. Its priests believed they were holding the fabric of existence together. Their rituals, strange, secretive, and disciplined, created a bridge between humans and gods. The so-called temple virgins were symbols of devotion and purity, not victims of dark rituals. And the priests, for all their flaws, were keepers of one of the most complex spiritual systems in human history. So what Egyptian priests did wasn't a nightmare, it was an extraordinary attempt to connect heaven and earth, order and chaos, life and death. The nightmare came later, when myths replaced understanding and rumor overshadowed truth. The real story of Egypt's temples isn't about cruelty or scandal, it's about how a civilization tried, for thousands of years, to keep the world in balance through faith, discipline, and devotion.
If you enjoyed diving into this strange, scandalous corner of history, make sure to unlock more secrets with us here at Throne of Scandals. Hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss a story hidden behind the golden doors of the past, because history is full of mysteries.